Canto 9 ends with Dante and Virgil walking into the conquered fortress to see what precious things the demons were so intent to protect. And we're rather surprised to discover what it is. An eerie graveyard in which all the lids of the big stone sarcophagi are off and standing to the side. The pilgrim can see a flame gleaming in each tomb, burning from below. This is the pathetic treasure being guarded by the demons. The souls in heaven will be described as precious gems, but the wealth of hell are the dead, gaunt, self-absorbed souls of those punished within. Note that this is a major transition. Virgil and Dante pass another portal, this time the Gate of Dis, as if to signify a major transition from one part of hell to another. And shortly after they walk through this gate, Dante poet in Canto 11 will take the opportunity to help organize the many bewildering things his pilgrim has experienced and will experience. In the first 10 canti, as we have seen, the pilgrim has a number of intense face-to-face encounters with sinners, but he doesn't seem to have been aware of how orderly hell actually is. But now his master informs him that hell is divided into two major divisions, separated by the walls of Dis. There is upper hell, whose circles we have read about, where the incontinent sins are punished, and lower hell, which is surrounded by the grimy iron walls of Dis. It is within the walls of Dis, or within lower hell, that the sins of malice are punished. Dante, who is loosely cobbling together all kinds of classical theories about vice, thinks that the deep principle which divides the sins of upper hell, the incontinent, from the sins of lower hell, the violent, fraudulent, and traitorous, is malice. That is, the willingness to use force against the natural laws of nature, or the willingness to use force against your neighbor to get what you want. In the end, the sinners of deep hell want the same things the sinners of upper hell want, even if they act like they're more sophisticated. But the truth is, they too are greedy, wrathful, gluttonous, and lustful. The difference is, they're willing to hurt fellow human beings or themselves to get what they want. Such violent sinners are punished, Virgil goes on to tell us, in one of the three big circles which make up lower hell. The first is the circle where the violent are punished. Then there's a deep pit and a dark shaft which leads down to the second circle where the fraudulent are punished. And finally, at the very base of hell, the pilgrim will encounter the traitorous. As you can see, the architecture of hell is very precise. Many have joked about hell's bureaucratic efficiency. And indeed, each circle has its own acting supervisor who has his own team of field investigators to help him manage his clients. This lecture, though, will deal only with the graveyard of the heretics, which, interestingly enough, does not figure at all into Virgil's architectural plan. And then the first of those three big circles where all types of violence are punished. Now we return to the spooky graveyard just within the walls of Dis, which the poet compares to an old medieval graveyard. As Virgil says of this circle at the end of Canto 9, "Here with all their followers are the arch-heretics of every sect. The tombs are far more laden than you think." In the next canto, Virgil gives us an additional piece of information about this mysterious region. He identifies one particular group of heretics. Here, Epicurus with all his followers, who hold the soul dies with the body, have their burial place. It's immediately after this that the pilgrim is surprised by two souls who hear his Florentine accent and rise up out of the tomb to speak to him. The first soul is a great general who died the year before Dante was born, Farinata degli Uberti. And the second soul is Cavalcanti, the father of Dante's best friend, Guido Cavalcanti, who was also a love poet. Guido exerted a great influence on Dante's early poetry. But Guido's poetry, unlike Dante's early love poems about Beatrice, was decidedly this worldly. He's been called the poet of interiority, and he was especially concerned with the joy and pain of love as experienced in this life. Thus it makes sense why his father is classified among those who followed the sins of Epicurus, that is, those heretics who denied the immortality of the soul and lived only for the goods of this life. Cavalcanti pops up in the middle of Dante's conversation with Farinata to ask about his son. But when Dante accidentally uses a past tense verb, Cavalcanti mistakenly believes that his son is now dead. Then, beside Farinata in the open tomb, up came a shade visible to the chin. He looked around me as though he wished to see if someone else were with me. And when his hesitant hopes were crushed, weeping, he said, "Where is my son, and why is he not with you?" And I to him, "I come not on my own. He who stands there waiting leads me through. Perhaps to one your Guido held in scorn." "What? Did you say he held? Lives he not still?" When he perceived that I made some delay, he fell backward and showed himself no more. This is a fascinating little exchange, because it represents, in a way, the very heretical intellectual habit which landed Cavalcanti and the others in this section of hell in the first place. Cavalcanti is devastated to learn, as he thinks, of his son's death. For a man for whom only earthly life, family, sophisticated cultivation, and learning were important, his son is the last one through whom he can vicariously enjoy the joys of earthly life. Thus Cavalcanti has that sectarian mentality fundamental to the heretic. He fiercely clings to a particular band of human beings, in this case, his family. At the same time, though, he gives the pilgrim absolutely no time to respond. When Cavalcanti perceived that I made some delay, before I answered, he fell backward. On the basis of one word, Cavalcanti draws huge conclusions, but then he fixates upon that one idea and acts upon it immediately, without giving himself any more time to hear evidence which might enable him to change or broaden his opinion. Again, in a similar way, the heretic seizes on a few opinions and then rigidly holds on to them, refusing to allow any new evidence or ideas into his mind, which might make him capable of revising those mistaken beliefs. But the great figure of this canto is the old general, Farinata. He stands alongside Francesco da Rimini, the lover from Canto 5, and Ulysses, whom we will meet in Inferno 26, as one of the most powerful and clearly developed characters of the Inferno. Dante clearly admires him. In fact, Virgil tells Dante to choose his words with great care. And later, Farinata is called magnanimo, that is, magnanimous in verse 73, the same word which was used for Virgil. Thus, in some ways, Farinata is a modern Florentine counterbalance to Virgil and Aeneas, at least in this one attribute of magnanimity. Here in Canto 10, he rises up with a stately self-confidence and perfect self-control, the posture of a dignified soldier who commands the respect of all those around him, even when he doesn't explicitly ask for it. He was like a Florentine Washington or Lee. As Dante puts it, he was rising, lifting chest and brow, as though he held all hell in utter scorn. In a way, the old campaigner's strength and resolve haven't dissipated in hell. He's a man accustomed to enduring hardship, such that even here, his dignity is barely broken by the dreadful surroundings. The question of Farinata's heretical belief, whether or not he denied the immortality of the soul, ironically, doesn't show up at all as an issue in this canto. We have to ask then, as we did for Cavalcanti, whether or not his heretical disposition is somehow on display in how he goes about conversing with the pilgrim. And we note immediately that Farinata does display that partisan spirit, a radically sectarian mentality in his dedication to his political party. His first question of Dante is, "Who were your ancestors?" He does not ask, "Who are you?" or "What are you doing here?" He seems hardly amazed that a man in flesh is walking among the shades of the dead. There's only one thing on Farinata's mind, the old strife between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, that is, between the papal supporters and the imperial supporters. And when he learns that Dante was a Guelph, he replies, "They were most bitter enemies to me. My forebears and my party, not once but twice, I had to drive them out." Farinata had led his exiled Ghibellines to a successful victory at the Battle of Montaperti in 1260. That is, 5 years before Dante's birth. And magnanimously, He exhorted his party to deal with the defeated Guelph party with leniency. But Florence never properly acknowledged him for this generous act, and eventually exiled many of his family members. Thus, the undying resentment he still bears with him, even in hell. In fact, Farinata, in a Medusa-like way, is frozen. Although he barely seems to register his external punishment, he locks his jaws and clenches his fist forever at the memory of that party strife. His resentment smolders within him forever. He has, as it were, been given exactly what he wants. He remains committed to his party with a fanatical sectarian devotion forever. Farinata holds one truth, maintains one loyalty. But ironically, the strife between Guelphs and Ghibellines was in fact a little out of date. In Dante's day, in Florence, there were only Guelphs. And so Farinata is a little like someone who still thinks of the world as divided, let's say, between Democrats and Whigs, even though the latter party disappeared long ago. Indeed, neither Cavalcanti nor Farinata's devotion to family or party are evil in themselves, but because they love them, and them alone, idolatrously, and have trained themselves to admit no new ideas, they bar from their minds any other vision of reality of humans and of ideas, and thus their love is frozen. Their sectarian love metastasized into an unforgiving sorrow. After Virgil and Dante leave the circle of the heretics, they must slip and slide down the scree of a mountainside, and when they arrive at the bottom, they're standing on the circle of the violent. From Canti 12 to 16, Dante and Virgil walk through this realm, which Dante imagines as a huge circle. The circle itself is formed up of 3 rings which wrap around one another, and each ring takes the form of a different kind of landscape. The pilgrim and Virgil follow a stream which cuts across these rings toward the center of the circle, where the pit is found, which will lead them to the most evil parts of hell. In the outermost of these 3 rings, Dante and Virgil see those who are violent against others, that is, those who harmed their neighbors' bodies or those who harmed their neighbors' possessions. In the second ring is where we find those who were violent against themselves, both those who were violent against their own bodies, suicides, and those who were violent against their possessions, that is, those who radically wasted their own property. And finally, the pilgrim will see those who are violent against God, that is, blasphemers, but also those who are violent against God by violating his nature, a category which for Dante includes sodomy and, interestingly enough, usury. The guardian of those violent against others are, appropriately enough, the mythological centaurs. It's appropriate because these thick-bearded, thumatic creatures were more rage than reason, more horse than man, a fact which Dante points out throughout this canto through a series of small details. In any case, one of these centaurs, Nessus, gives Dante a tour of the souls of Phlegethon. Here is this blood-red, boiling river, and the pilgrim sees conquerors like Alexander the Great, ancient tyrants like Dionysius of Syracuse, as well as more modern Italian tyrants. These are plunged in the boiling river all the way up to their eyebrows. In life, they were often stained by hot blood. In death, they get what they freely chose in life. Then Dante sees also those who assassinated out of vengeance, and he hears about souls on the far side of the circle who were completely submerged in the depths of the river. Those who were outrageously destructive and violent, who loved plunder and war for its own sake, who made no pretense that their deeds were aimed at some final end. Dante mentions Attila the Hun, as well as highwaymen and pirates. From here, the 2 wayfarers continue to move toward the center of the circle, proceeding into the inner ring, where they walk through a dark wood, full of underbrush, made up of ugly, gnarled, thorny plants. This is where Dante and Virgil meet the suicides, those who tossed away their lives, as well as those who squandered away their resources, I suppose like some modern playboy or celebrity. After this, they will walk into yet another landscape, that of the innermost ring, which most immediately encircles the pit. This is a desert landscape, completely barren of all life, upon which slow and large snowflakes, made of fire, drift down and land on the skin of those who are violent against God or violent against his nature. If you pause to think about the imaginative world we have walked through to this point, from the initial dark wood and the sun-bathed mountain in Canto 1, to the allusions the poet made to the sea, from the wind-swept plains of the circle of the lustful, to the rain and hail and snow of the realm of the gluttonous, from the muddy river which turns into the swampy marshlands of the Styx, to the castles, fortified gates, eerie graveyards, and now these rivers, woods, and desert landscapes, then you can see the extraordinary power of Dante's imagination. He seems to be trying to incorporate not only a full range of characters from ancient history to his present age, but also an encyclopedic representation of all possible landscapes. The whole world is meant to be fit into this poem. At this point, though, having taken this view from above, or having zoomed out for a moment, I want to zoom in and consider three memorable scenes in a bit more detail. The first comes from Inferno 13. It's the conversation that Dante has with Pierre delle Vigne, who was a minor official in the court of Frederick II in Sicily in the early 1200s. A character we probably all would have forgotten about if he had not been made immortal in the comedy. The second comes from Canto 15, where Dante meets yet another Florentine who died in 1294. That is, right about the time Dante was working on his Vita Nuova. This is Brunetto Latini, whom Dante describes as his beloved teacher. And finally, in Canto 16 and 17, Dante goes back to ancient mythology, this time to borrow from the old poets to create a frightening monster, Geryon, who will be forced to give Dante a ride on his back. Okay, with this little roadmap, let's turn to Inferno 13. In Inferno 13, Dante walks into a thick, dark, almost haunted wood, which he goes to great length to describe as completely barren of clean, healthy, and productive plants, though packed with vegetation. No green leaves, not a straight branch but knotted and contorted, no fruit of any kind but poisonous thorns. It's a wood of rough and dense thickets, an abode for wild beasts. Here, spooky voices are heard speaking, crying, and lamenting, echoing among the vegetation, although Dante cannot see a single embodied soul. Those of you who remember Virgil's Aeneid will recall a scene in which the hero Aeneas encounters a land which had become spiritually polluted because of an act of betrayal and murder. Aeneas goes up to a plant, snaps off a twig, and to his horror, human blood flows forth from the broken stem. However, this act allows the soul imprisoned within the plant to issue his breath through the gurgling blood, and he tells his sad story. He tells Aeneas that he was Polydorus, the son of Priam, who, when Troy was nearing its inevitable end, was sent with gold to be protected on foreign shores. But the local king, who was supposed to be his protector and host, slaughtered him to steal his riches. Dante has calqued this episode, but interestingly has placed not an innocent soul into his thorn bush, but one who would wish to appear so. He's Pierre delle Vigne, an official in the court of Frederick II. Here Pierre, when the pilgrim snaps one of the twigs which makes up the house for his soul, asks the pilgrim, "Why do you break me? Have you no pity in you?" And then proceeds to tell his story. Again, Dante is the master of the uncanny, isn't he? He creates scenes sometimes of great power and violence, but sometimes of encounter with spiritual forces which causes your hair to stand on end, as if you were walking into a haunted house. Pierre then tells his story. "I am the one who held both keys to Frederick's heart, and I could turn them, locking and unlocking so discreetly. I kept his secret safe from almost everyone. So faithful was I to that glorious office that first I lost my sleep and then my life. The slut who never took her whoring eyes from Caesar's household, the common bane and special vice of courts, inflamed all minds against me. And they, inflamed, did so inflame Augustus, that welcome honors turned to dismal woe. My mind in scornful temper, hoping by dying to escape from scorn, made me, though just, against myself unjust." Pierre then was a victim of the envy of the other courtiers. And those envious rivals went so far to tarnish his reputation that the emperor, that is Friedrich II, who's called Caesar and Augustus in this passage, came to believe that Pierre had been embezzling funds. The destruction of his reputation destroyed his career, and as he says, made me, though just, against myself unjust. That is, he took his own life because of his unfairly tarnished reputation. Not surprisingly, the pilgrim is compassionate. In fact, so compassionate that he cannot ask him any more questions because such pity fills his heart. Verse 84. The soul goes on to explain the contrapasso of this canto. Because the suicides so little valued their bodies and their lives that they tossed them off, then their souls are haphazardly tossed among these filthy bushes, where they take root in this dark and evil forest. Here again we note another sympathetic portrayal of a damned soul, and much like the canto with Francesca, the pilgrim and the reader is left with a great compassion. Does that mean that the story of Pierre is tragedy? That the wrath of God has punished him unfairly? Perhaps the Virgilian passage can help us begin to unravel this fearful paradox. In Virgil's account, the soul trapped in the branches was innocent, the victim of what Virgil calls that cursed hunger for gold. It was a story then of evil committed out of avarice, the sick and evil craving which values wealth and personal advancement over human lives. But to our surprise, it becomes evident that Pierre, too, although innocent of the crimes which he was accused of, also was guilty of avaritia, but not an avarice for money, but an excessive fondness for his own reputation. Thomas Aquinas had said that just as a man can be greedy for wealth, so too can he be greedy for honor. He can love his reputation for being successful. He can love his reputation for climbing the ranks of the corporate ladder. He can also be greedy to be known as a man of learning and wisdom. In such a situation, that ambitious man loves the created good of his own reputation more than he loves primal love. Thus, Pierre de Lévigny, although indeed unjustly accused, threw away his own life because he couldn't see anything else worth living for. But he forgot that the one love, which can never be taken away, would have willingly remained with him even in his prison cell. If we also briefly recall the famous Roman senator Boethius, whose Consolation of Philosophy so influenced Dante, then we can also realize the sick and sad irony of Pierre's decision. Pierre, if he had a longer view of history, could have become the kind of suffering hero who would have indeed have gained the very fame throughout the long ages to come. He could have got the very reputation he sought in court, but he didn't. When his reputation was stolen, he forgot that he still had his life, his memory, his breath, his maker. We come now to our second close reading. This one of a scene in Canto 15, where we meet the Florentine Brunetto Latini. Canto 15 has a very different tone from the pitiful, dark, and sighing lamentation of Canto 13. Indeed, Dante's work has a kind of symphonic quality, in which each of the canti, like different movements, has a different tempo, a different mood, and a different key. This Brunetto, though, is not in the wood, but in the desert wasteland, like those in Canto 14. But not because he was blasphemous. Rather, he walks about the area where the sin of sodomy is punished. We should note right away that the medieval understanding of sodomy was much broader than we might think today. In fact, it consisted of any use of human sexuality which was not formally open to the procreation of children, if I may state it delicately. Thus, certain private sins would fall into this category of sodomy. For the medievals, you can commit sodomy alone. And it can also take place between male and female couples. Thus, the sin at its base for the medievals seems to be a sin against fruitfulness, the transformation of a fruitful act into a sterile one. Remember that this sin is punished in an absolutely barren desert landscape. But there are some mysteries about the canto. For example, there's no historical evidence whatsoever that Brunetto was guilty of any form of this sin. And Dante is absolutely silent on the subject. What is more, the pilgrim goes a long way to show great reverence for his former teacher, Brunetto. In 1545, Dante says he walked with his head bowed. Later, he praises Brunetto, saying, "I remember well the cherished, kind, paternal image of you. You taught me how man makes himself immortal, and how much gratitude I owe for that. My tongue, while I still live, must give report. It's a very affectionate conversation, as if, going back to your hometown or college, you accidentally run into your favorite high school teacher or college professor when he's walking through the halls. You still bear a kind of filial love for those who made a difference in your life when you were young. Similarly, Dante's gratitude is real and palpable here. It's not only that he learned from Brunetto how to achieve certain things, but even that his very dreams, his very ability to think that some things were worthy of pursuit, is also the gift of Brunetto. Thus, although we have a barren landscape as the setting for the punishment of the sin of sodomy, we have these fatherly images used for Brunetto. It's another one of Dante's literary puzzles. Why is Brunetto here? Dante never tells us directly. We'll come back to Inferno 15 in a moment, but if we turn to Inferno 16 very quickly, we can pick up a couple of clues to help us understand the Brunetto scene. In Inferno 16, Dante meets three more individuals being punished in the same place for the same sin. They are Guido Guerra, Tegiaio Adobrandi, and Jacopo Rusticucci. Again, very mysteriously, Dante does not explain why these three men, local political and military heroes in medieval Florence, are among the sodomites. Rather, Dante only tells us how much these men command his respect. They were, so to speak, like Florentine versions of Washington, Adams, and Lincoln. However, the question they pose to Dante might be telling. Remember now that twice Dante has berated Florence for the root causes of its evil, abusing Florence for its avarice, envy, and pride. In contrast to this, the three heroes ask Dante, "Tell us if valor and courtesy still live there in our city, as once they used to do, or have they utterly forsaken her?" As we know, these courtly knightly virtues, manly strength and self-controlled chivalry, were dear to Dante. But here in hell, they seem a little out of place, don't they? Worry about these things misses the mark a bit, and that they're not theological vices. Again, it would rather be like meeting an American in hell who lamented over the country's decline and asked, is the country really off is it really as bad off as I hear? I mean, are Americans no longer enterprising and self-reliant? Though certainly virtues, it seems rather that they miss the deepest problems, the spiritual vices which corrupt Florence from the inside. Turning back to Brunetto, we note how insistent Dante is to credit Brunetto with teaching him, quote, how man makes himself immortal, verse 85. Probably through achieving literary fame. Brunetto Latini was a politician, a diplomat, and a man of letters in Florence. He wrote a vast prose encyclopedia in French, a long didactic poem in Italian, as well as a book on rhetoric in Italian. And thus it makes sense to hear him reassure Dante, by following your star, you cannot fail to reach a glorious port, if I saw clearly in the happy life. Even Brunetto's closing words also touch upon this theme of memory, fame, and literary immortality. Let my treasure, that is Brunetto's encyclopedic treatise, let my treasure in which I still live on be in your mind. I ask for nothing more. Dante then clearly shows that Brunetto taught him the literary craft by which a man can make a lasting contribution to humanity. But surely within the theological context of eternity, there's something badly mistaken to wish only to be remembered for your literary work. As Brunetto says, I ask for nothing more. Brunetto seems in the context of hell to have an extraordinary spiritual myopia. Indeed, in light of what the pilgrim will see in the third canticle, Paradiso, Brunetto's understanding of glory and eternity seem sadly limited. The pilgrim will see things so glorious that they will burn his eyes. He will hear music so sweet that he won't even be able to recall its beauty. In light of the unspeakable beauty and the ineffably true, Brunetto's literary accomplishments and goals seem paltry. Thus, the sad truth is that Brunetto was a kind of failed father who set up his literary adopted son Dante well, but he did not set him up for a life of ultimate fruitfulness. His fatherly love, we could say, was somewhat sterile in that it generated love only for the earthly good of reputation and fame. At this point, we have to move on to the final part of this lecture, but it's a very exciting one, the flight of Geryon. At the end of Canto 16, after Dante has spoken to the usurers, we come to a very mysterious passage. Virgil enacts a very mysterious ritual. He asks Dante to take off the cord he has used to gird his cloak about him, and then he throws the cord into a vast pit which yawns in front of them. There is a moment of tense expectancy. The pilgrim expects some strange sign, some event of thing never seen before to happen. And soon he sees it. Responding to this beckoning gesture comes a terrifying beast which would have caused, quote, amazement to the stoutest heart. It is una figura maravillosa. That is, something marvelous and stupefying, something which makes your mouth agape. Dante describes this beast to Geryon in the next canto. It had the features of a righteous man, benevolent in countenance, but all the rest of it was serpent. It had 4 paws, hairy to the armpits, and back and chest and both its flanks were painted and inscribed with rings and curlicues. Its length of tail lashed in the void, twisting up its forked and venomed tip, armed like a scorpion's tail. According to classical legend, Geryon was a crooked man who would cause people to put their trust in him, invite them into his house, but then kill them, having posed as a kindly host. Dante here has given Geryon the disgusting visual appearance of evil and fraud which he deserved. As the poet does so often, he has externalized the interior of the evil heart. It's a kind of evil incarnation in which the spirit of the heart takes up the flesh which suits it. And then to his astonishment, Virgil tells Dante that he is supposed to ride this thing. The pilgrim is appropriately terrified. He describes himself as a man suffering from malaria, shaking and racked with fever and chills and shaking pains. And it all seems like a big trap, doesn't it? A big setup. A hideous beast, renowned in the world for luring people to their deaths through a false trust, flies up from the lower portions of hell, where deceit and fraud are punished. And now Dante is supposed to climb on the back of the monster, trusting the advice of his guide. Faith is not an easy virtue, even if you have every reason to believe a trustworthy authority. Well, reluctantly the pilgrim does so. He climbs up on the back of Geryon, and Virgil lovingly and reassuringly positions himself between the pilgrim and the scorpion stinger of a tail. And then the monster pushes off and flies and floats and turns and twists, sailing and gliding down through the immeasurably deep hole which leads to the next level of hell. This passage is a poetic tour de force, which Dante seems to have been really proud of. Again, we have to imagine how this must have struck the poet's original audience, a world without television, DVDs, and CGI special effects. Dante, through his poetry, wants to make you feel the fluttering of the stomach which you get that first moment when you suddenly drop down from a height. He wants you to feel the dizzy, vertiginous sensation of a state fair ride which is broken off its base and come loose. But it's also very interesting, very problematic, that the poet compares the pilgrim's wild ride to 2 disastrous flights from ancient mythology. Phaeton, the son of Apollo, was allowed to try to control his father's sun chariot. But the young man, not being a god himself, lost control of the wild horses of the sun chariot and had to be struck down by Zeus so he wouldn't crash into the earth and scorch all the living things on the surface. Dante also compares his ride to that of Icarus, the son of Daedalus. His father equipped him with wings of wax and feathers, which he and his father used to escape the labyrinth. But Icarus flew too close to the sun, which caused his wings to melt, and without the ability to fly, he fell and crashed into the ocean below. Keep these ideas in mind as we read the passage. Geryon, move on now, Virgil says. Let your circles be wide and your descending slow. As a bark backs slowly from its mooring, so the beast backed off the ledge, and when it fell itself adrift, turned its tail to where the chest had been, and extending its tail made it wriggle like an eel's while with its paws it gathered in the air. Phaeton, I think, felt no greater fear when he released the reins and and the whole sky was scorched, as we still see. Nor wretched Icarus, when he felt the melting, was unfeathered the wings along his back and heard his father shout, not that way. Then was my terror when I saw air everywhere around, and all things gone from sight except the beast. On it goes swimming slowly to slowly, wheeling, descending, but I feel only the wind in my face blowing from below. In his usual fashion, Dante's words try to build into their very sound something of the action described. Verses 115 to 117 describe the swimming slowly, slowly, wheeling, descending of the flight, which Dante gets with Ella sen va nuotando lenta, lenta, rotto e discende. Nothing like this in literature before Dante existed. It must have been absolutely thrilling to encounter it for the first time, almost too frightening to recite to children. But this scene is more than Dante's high-action, momentary experimentation with a kind of sci-fi poetry. It seems that Dante wants us to associate this extraordinary flight with his own poetry. In other words, somehow, some way, Dante thinks that his poem is doing something akin to this flight of Geryon. All the excitement, all the terror, all the vertiginous wheeling and spinning. On the most basic level, it seems that his poetry, as we have said before, tries to dredge the depth of the human heart. In some sense, the sins against words, the sly and subtle manipulation of images, are sins which remain even for us, hidden in the dark, like Geryon who has slept in the depths of hell until made to come forth. Dante then, I think, summons from the depths the image of fraud, exposes it as hideously ugly and plainly ridiculous. He wakes up what we'd rather, for the most part, let remain hidden and obscured far below. But the question still remains, and it is this question I want to leave you with. Why compare the form of the message to this strange hybrid monster, a beast made out of the stuff of ancient mythology, and then a wild ride in which we feel the dizzying twist and turn of the rapid wind-rushing descent? Why take the old myths, the untethered workings of the imagination, and try to submit them to the service of Christian truth?